我宣布，安全理事会第
The 9,868th meeting of the Security Council is called to order. The provisional agenda for this meeting is the situation in the Middle East. The agenda is adopted. In accordance with Rule 37 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I invite the representatives of Israel and Kuwait to participate in this meeting. It is so decided. In accordance with the Provisional Rules of Procedure and past practice, I propose that the Council invite the permanent observer of the Observer State of Palestine to the United Nations to participate in the meeting. There being no objection, it is so decided. In accordance with Rule 39 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I invite the following briefers to participate in this meeting. Ms. Sigrid Kaag, United Nations Special Coordinator for the Middle East Peace Process ad interim, Ms. Noah Agamani, and Mr. Daniel Levy, President of the U.S. Middle East Project. It is so decided. The Security Council will now begin its consideration of Item 2 of the agenda. I now give the floor to Ms. Sigrid Kaag.
This is good. I'm happy that you're sitting next to me.
You have the floor, madam.
Oh, apologies. Before I start, Mr. President, I'd like to acknowledge the presence of Ms. Noah Argamani, and I pay her, all hostages, living and deceased, and their families my deepest respect and support. And we grieve with all victims, their families and their loved ones. Mr. President, members of the Security Council, the Middle East today is undergoing a rapid transformation. Its scope and impact remain uncertain, but it presents a historic opportunity. The people of the region can emerge from this period with peace, security, and dignity. However, this may be our last chance to achieve the two-state solution. Mr. President, it cannot be repeated enough, nothing justifies the appalling October 7th terror attacks executed by Hamas and other Palestinian armed groups. And I welcome the implementation of the first phase of the ceasefire, including the release of 34 hostages. And I echo the Secretary General's condemnation of the public parading of hostages released by Hamas, including statements made under duress and the appalling display of the coffins of deceased hostages. I think none of us will forget the harrowing pictures of the coffins of the Bibas children taken hostage with their mother and killed while in captivity. The image of Israeli hostages released show clear signs of ill treatment, reflecting the very dire conditions they were subjected to in Gaza. And I reiterate that all hostages must be released unconditionally, and while in captivity, they must be allowed to receive visits and assistance from the International Committee of the Red Cross. Mr. President, the trauma is undeniable on both sides. In Gaza, death, destruction, and multiple displacement has been inflicted upon the Palestinian civilians in the Gaza Strip. While the first phase of the ceasefire has provided a surge of much-needed relief, far more remains to be done over the 50 months of deprivation of basic human necessities and, above all, a loss of human dignity. In my last visit to Gaza, soon after the ceasefire came into effect, I was once again moved by a sense of utter devastation, young and old, and despair due to loss, trauma, and a sense of abandonment by the international community. As part of the ceasefire deal, Mr. President, 1,135 Palestinian prisoners and detainees have been released so far. Reports of serious ill treatment and humiliation during their detention are concerning. Mr. President, since the first phase of the ceasefire came into effect on the 19th of January, the United Nations, NGOs and Member States have expedited and scaled up life-saving humanitarian assistance into Gaza. Improved access and security conditions have allowed for the delivery of assistance and services. Medical evacuations through the Rafah crossing began on the 1st of February, facilitating the transfer to Egypt of sick and injured patients in accordance with the ceasefire deal. Mr. President, the resumption of hostilities must be avoided at all cost, and I call on both sides to fully honour their commitments to the ceasefire deal and conclude negotiations for the second phase. I commend the mediators Egypt, Qatar and the United States for their steadfast work in securing the first phase and pursuing the second phase. Mr. President, as we address the immediate needs in Gaza, we must also build a future that offers protection, recovery and reconstruction. As you know, the World Bank, EU and UN have released an updated interim rapid damage and needs assessment for Gaza's recovery and reconstruction. Initial estimates indicate that 53 billion will be required for this effort. Arab states are leading the efforts to devise a plan for the rebuilding of Gaza, with Egypt planning to host a conference dedicated to Gaza's reconstruction. The UN is ready to support reconstruction efforts. Palestinian civilians must be able to resume their lives, to rebuild and to construct their future in Gaza. There can be no question of forced displacement. Mr. President, while international attention is focused on Gaza, I am concerned about military operations, attacks and mounting violence in the West Bank. Casualties, destruction and displacement continue to be reported, particularly in Jenin, Tubas and Tulkarem governorates, where refugee camps and infrastructure are heavily impacted. Many of these areas are in Area A under the Palestinian Authority's civil and security responsibility. Israeli forces have deployed airstrikes and other heavy weaponry, whilst Palestinian militants have used improvised explosive devices and carried out shooting attacks. This takes place alongside continued violence and intimidation by Israeli settlers against Palestinians and attacks by Palestinians against Israelis. Following the detonation of 3 bombs on empty buses near Tel Aviv in a suspected terror attack, the IDF has increased its troop presence in the West Bank. I am alarmed by the killing of a pregnant woman and young children during these operations. These incidents must be thoroughly investigated and those responsible held to account. Mr. President, regarding continued illegal settlement activity, approximately 2,000 new housing units have been advanced in recent weeks, mostly in Area C. State land declarations and settler outposts impede Palestinian land use for farming, while demolitions and evictions have been accelerated. Severe moving restrictions continue to paralyze daily life for many Palestinians, hindering access to essential services and economic activity. These developments, along with continued calls for annexation, present an existential threat to the prospect of a viable and independent Palestinian state and thereby the two-state solution. Mr. President, Israeli legislation that bans UNRWA from operating in Israel and occupied East Jerusalem took effect on the 30th of January 2025. The Secretary General has condemned the breach of inviolability of the United Nations premises in occupied East Jerusalem. UNRWA's work remains essential and must be allowed to continue unimpeded. Mr. President, the Palestinian Authority, as has been reported, continues to implement agreed-upon reforms, including fiscal and public finance policy, governance and rule of law, for the investment climate and basic service provision. In early February, the Palestinian Authority issued a decree cancelling financial payments to the families of Palestinians killed or imprisoned following attacks on Israelis. This represents an important step in the Palestinian Authority's reform agenda, and it should be fully implemented. Mr. President, turning briefly to the region, in Lebanon, the election of the president and formation of the new government provide an opportunity to fully empower state institutions in laying the foundation for greater stability, to extend state authority, and address the country's multifaceted challenges. And I call upon Lebanon and Israel to uphold their commitments upon the cessation of hostilities and undertake meaningful steps towards the full implementation of Security Council Resolution 1701 to restore stability and allow the people on both sides of the blue line to return home. In southwest Syria, the UN is concerned by violations of the 1974 Disengagement of Forces Agreement, and I urge the parties to uphold their obligations under the agreement. Mr. President, since assuming the role of Special Coordinator for the Middle East peace process ad interim, my team and I have actively engaged with all relevant parties. I've initiated consultations in the region and will continue to engage with key stakeholders. These consultations have reaffirmed there is no sustainable resolution to the current war or wider conflict that is not fundamentally political. As we engage in planning for Gaza's future, we need to ensure, 1, Gaza remains an integral part of a future Palestinian state. 2, Gaza and the West Bank, including East Jerusalem, are unified politically, economically, and administratively. 3, there will be no long-term IDF presence in Gaza, and Israel's legitimate security concerns are addressed. We need to commit to ending the occupation and a final resolution of the conflict based on UN resolutions, international law, and previous agreements. I would like to make 4 key requests. First, continued support for the full realization of the ceasefire deal, including the release of all hostages. This is critical. Second, it is crucial not to lose sight of the dangerous dynamics in the West Bank and urgent de-escalation which is needed. Third, the international community must continue to support the Palestinian Authority in its reform efforts and its resumption of responsibilities in the Gaza Strip. Palestinian security forces should also be empowered to carry out their responsibilities in areas under their control. Fourth, politically and financially support Gaza's recovery and reconstruction effort. Mr. President, peace in the Middle East is possible. We can achieve a future where a safe and secure Israel exists, alongside a viable and independent Palestinian state. This requires continued concerted efforts, dedication, and political courage by all parties. The United Nations will continue to play its role in pursuit of lasting peace. Thank you.
I thank Ms. Karg for her briefing. I now give the floor to Ms. Noor Agamani.
Hello. My name is Noor Agamani, and a really great honor to be here with you today. I was kidnapped by Hamas terrorists on October 7 from the Nova Music Festival with my partner, Avinatan Or. We were taken by force into Gaza. We were held in total fear, living in a nightmare. After 8 months in captivity, I was rescued by the Israeli soldiers. Being here today is a miracle. But I'm here today to tell you, we have no time. As I speak, there is still 63 hostages living in a nightmare, including my partner, Avinatan Or. In fact, we believe that 24 of them are alive. Many of them send sight of life through released hostages. Our life cannot go without them. And that is why I need to make sure that the world knows that. The deal must go on, in full and completely, in all the stages. My partner, Avinatan Or, and many other hostages are only supposed to be released in the second stage of the deal. We are talking about innocent people detained from this bed, from a dance party, from their simple life, into a pure hell. You don't need me to tell you about the 9-month-old Kfir and 4-year-old Ariel Bibas and their mother Shiri. Just a mother and her babies were brutally murdered in captivity. The crime is unthinkable. We cannot imagine it, but it happened. And that's why we cannot leave anyone there. I know what is the feeling to be left behind. I watch other hostages being released to their families. Every moment feels like the last moment of their life. Every second counts. While I was in Gaza, I was held with 2 little girls, Ila Rotem and Emily Hand. At that time, Emily was 8 years old and Ila was 12. I had to be brave, not only for myself, but also for the girls. I had to act like everything is going to be okay. And that's why I keep telling them, as long as we're here together, alive, in this room, nothing else matters. I told them to ignore all the booming, all the sound of shooting, and everything that was around us. Ila and Emily are both released in the first hostage deal after 50 days. I watched them and 2 other women who've been with me in captivity going back home to their families. As I will stay behind. I wasn't a part of any category that could be released. I can't even begin to describe the feeling of being the one that left behind. But I can tell this is exactly how the hostages are feeling today, abandoned by the world. After 54 days in captivity, it was just me, Itai Svirsky, and Yossi Sharabi. Both of them was kidnapped from their houses in Kibbutz Be'eri. We were in a war zone 24/7. It's terrifying for every day, for every second. One evening, the house that we all be holding was blown up, and we found ourselves in the destructions. Itai was able to stand up, and Yossi and I was stuck under the rebels. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. I thought it's going to be my last second of my life. I screamed so loud so someone would hear me. And I heard Yossi screaming too. But after a few seconds, I stopped hearing from Yossi. I was pulled out of the rebels, and I tried to help Yossi. But it was already too late. Yossi was a close friend of mine, and he was a pure, kind soul. He will always be in my heart. Itai and I had to find someone else to hide. So one of our captors took us to another house. But 2 days later, Itai was murdered by the same captor. Itai was with me since the first day in captivity. We told each other everything. He was my true soulmate. May memory be a blessing. Hamas published a video of me describing what happened to Itai and Yossi, and that I was injured and needed medical help. But of course, I got nothing. No doctors, no Red Cross, nothing. From that moment, I was by myself with 5 terrorists holding me in the same house. You must understand, every second in captivity is dangerous. I didn't think that I could make Abel alive. This is why it's absolutely critical that we put end from this horrible tragedy. Without immediate action, many more innocent people will be killed, including my partner, Avinatan Or. Until Avinatan returns, my heart is in captivity. Today, I come before you to say, do not let the darkness take over. Work hard to get everyone home now. Work for the light and against the darkness. I came today to the UN to speak before the Security Council because I believe that you all, international community, must understand that the hostages are in hell. And after losing so many friends, I can say they deserve to come back home now. What kept me alive in captivity, and until this very moment, it was something my mother used to tell me. Always be kind. So in this forum, let me end with that. Be kind to each other. And please, bring all of them. Bring them home now. Thank you very much.
I thank Ms. Agamani for her briefing. I now give the floor to Mr. Levy.
Thank you to the Council, the Chinese Presidency, Ambassador Fu. Good luck in your newest position, Special Coordinator Sigrid Kaag. I would like to offer some thoughts on the immediate challenges and the broader scaffolding required for a better future. Israelis deserve security. Palestinians deserve security. Zero-sum outcomes can never deliver that. An inescapable anchor of this reality is the acknowledgement of the power asymmetry between an occupying, colonizing state and an occupied, colonized people. But more important, before all of that, I want to really express how moving and good it is to see Ms. Agmani here, humbling and heartwarming. I, and I'm sure many others, have seen other images of you from different times. Now these times, you managed to accompany Prime Minister Netanyahu in Congress. You were on the stage for the inauguration of President Trump. Now here, thankfully safe. Your partner not yet. And it was so important to hear your testimony of an awful experience to which no human should ever be subjected, because it reminds us that at the end of the day, this is about people. Each story deeply personal, your strength in the face of adversity, the thousands upon thousands of stories of individual hardship, Israelis both fallen and still held captive, the tens of thousands of Palestinians killed, many more maimed, starved, lives devastated, schools, hospitals, shelters, entire neighborhoods destroyed, and yet the remarkable resilience also of Palestinians. Dr. Hussam Abu Safir, the director of Kamal Radwan Hospital, still mistreated and held in Israeli detention. One really must not forget the names of the Bibas children, Ariel and Kafir, the circumstances of their death, nor the name of Leila Al-Khatib, a 2-year-old Palestinian killed in her home in the occupied West Bank just days ago while eating dinner with her family, or 5-year-old Hind Rajab, bombed and denied medical attention, dead with her family. Those lost in the turned-off incubators of Al-Shifa Hospital. A minute of silence for each of the Bibas children would be appropriate, as would a minute of silence for each of the more than 18,000 Palestinian children murdered in Israel's devastation of Gaza. That silence would extend to over 300 hours. And our task is to prevent that conflict and that human suffering. And it results from political conflict, preventable tragedies, and the many more tragedies that await if steps are not taken. When you peel back the layers, We are all people and we are all born equal. We can and sometimes should use strong and emotive language, but what we have at the end of the day is rules, is laws, is charters, is conventions, is rights that are codified. Not what is seen in the eye of the beholder, not what is subjective, something that is supposed to, not always, is, be applied and not ignored for some. This body is architect, author, arbiter of those rules and statutes and conventions. And whether it's a non-state actor or a partisan resistance or a state, the question must always be, are you acting in accordance within those conventions and laws and charters? When Hamas is culpable, it is held accountable, sanctioned heavily. When an ambassador of a state stands at a UN podium with a little shredding machine and shreds the UN Charter, that's a gimmick. But when a state like Israel conducts itself in ways that render the Charter meaningless and which assault those conventions, including on genocide, rights, norms and laws that this body holds dear, then that is a challenge that cannot be allowed to pass. It is the kind of affront which decades ago led to apartheid South Africa being suspended from active participation at the UN. The prevention of humanitarian assistance, the targeting of aid workers, and even of workers of this institution, all while attacking the bodies that uphold international law, the International Court of Justice, the International Criminal Court, and claiming the moral high ground while making specious accusations that somehow upholding the law is motivated by anti-Semitism. That worries me because it also cheapens what is a very real and dangerous phenomenon of anti-Semitism. As I have suggested before to this chamber, the absence of accountability, absolute impunity, is a guarantor of perpetual conflict. And I would put it to you that ultimately it does the people of Israel no favors either. I want to offer a very brief checklist of what, in an immediate and more medium term, scaffolding could be on which one could construct peace. The first that has been referred to already is the imperative of maintaining and completing this ceasefire, the release of all the Israelis, your partner included, the exchange of prisoners, the full Israeli military withdrawal, the surging of humanitarian assistance, which should never have been prevented. That requires the parties to implement their commitments. It will require the withheld Palestinian prisoner release to be made good on. It requires the role of the guarantors. There is good reason to fear that this could collapse. There is good reason to fear a resumption of those tragedies, and in particular, a possible renewed attempt to permanently depopulate the north of Gaza. A number of the families of those being held still in Israel, those being held in Gaza, the families in Israel, including some who have been released, have taken to the squares and towns of Israel out of fear that the intention of their own government is not to see this through. Two, the premise for a full ceasefire must learn from history and be based on reality. Hamas non-governance in Gaza is achievable. The movement itself has said so. But no party to a conflict will negotiate its own dissolution unless it is destroyed on the battlefield or unless the root causes of the conflict are addressed. Hamas has not been defeated, and there will be resistance as long as there is the structural violence of occupation and apartheid. It is that simple. Three, a familiar pattern of displacing Palestinians from refugee camps, 40,000 so far, of destroying infrastructure, is being enacted now by Israel in the occupied West Bank. And Israeli government ministers are threatening to annex the territory and make life untenable for Palestinians. This after the ICJ designated the entirety of the occupation as illegal. As we enter the month of Ramadan, there are reasons to be concerned that provocations might intensify in Jerusalem and at Al-Aqsa. In an environment in which ethnic cleansing is openly discussed, we should not be surprised if that thought also comes to the West Bank. 4. Attempts to terminate the functioning of UNRWA are an integral part of this pattern. This body should be in no doubt that abruptly imploding UNRWA will contribute to greater insecurity and despair, a greater vacuum, and an escalating social and political crisis. One thing it will not do, though, is change the status of the refugees or negate their rights. 5. One of the most dangerous developments this body must be seized of is the lurch towards zero-sum thinking. Maybe it could be called the apartheid is not enough camp, whereby the very continued physical presence of Palestinians is something that part of the Israeli polity cannot abide. The unlawful forced displacement of Palestinians must not be endorsed or encouraged by any state, let alone a P5 state. Nothing can be more dangerous for either peoples than the notion that one people will be removed from the land. We know the circumstances under which many Jews came to this area. We know attempts have been made in the past to remove Palestinians. Neither people will be ethnically cleansed nor submitted to genocidal violence. That both people have a permanent home in this land should be a foundational principle. Given point 6, given the above, if a commitment to two states is to be meaningful, then, as you said, the urgency of generating a radically revised incentive structure cannot be exaggerated. I would argue that, quite simply, it will have to be imposed on the occupying power. And that is the stiff challenge facing the Global Alliance for the Implementation of the Two-State Solution and the International Conference due this summer. Partition was the solution bequeathed by this body when there were fewer than 60 members of the UN. 33 states voted for partition in 1947. Much of Africa, Asia, the Caribbean remained under Western colonial rule. In the absence of partition, what we have is a single dominion under an apartheid regime, all in a place where Christians, Jews, and Muslims have lived together in the past. How much longer can we ignore that in that single dominion, the legitimate alternative is the full enfranchisement, equal and democratic rights of all of those within that space? Let me close by saying that I think we do see a surrounding region keen to more actively assist in resolving this, not to normalize with occupation, but to integrate under peace and equality. In the global majority South, we have seen new waves of solidarity and something of the spirit of Bandung of 70 years ago. The launching of the Hague Group just 3 weeks ago takes this solidarity to a new level. Those states committed to something that should be so self-evident, to uphold the rulings of the ICC, the ICJ, of this body when it comes to Palestine. And I urge all law-respecting states to consider joining this group. And globally, we live in an era of multipolarity, which, if I may say, the Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi some days ago in Munich said equal rights, equal opportunities, and equal rules must be the basic principles to avoid the Pandora's box of the law of the jungle and to avoid zero-sum games and exceptionalism, end quote. Applied to Israelis and Palestinians, it means both peoples are part of the future of this land, not at the expense of each other, but equally deserving the right to live in peace, security, and dignity. Thank you.
I thank Mr. Levy for his briefing. I now give the floor to those council members who wish to make statements. I give the floor to His Excellency Mr. Georgios Gerotritis, Minister of Foreign Affairs of Greece.
Thank you, Mr. President. Esteemed colleagues, it's a unique opportunity for the Council members to exchange views on a very critical issue at critical times. And I would like to thank our briefers, Ms. Kag and Mr. Levy, for their briefings, but above all, Noa Gramani for her shocking and alarming personal testimony. Following decades of war and instability, the Middle East currently stands indeed at a turning point. The ceasefire agreements in Lebanon and Gaza demonstrate that peace may indeed be attainable. During my recent tour in the region, I had a close-up experience of that new momentum. The recent long-awaited ceasefire and hostage release agreement in Gaza is a great example of this momentum and a reminder for all of us of what can be achieved through political will. After all, peace, like war, can succeed only where there is a will to enforce it. Political will is truly the key to finally overcoming the harsh reality of war, and in this spirit, I commend the persistent mediating efforts of Egypt, Qatar, and the United States, which continue to oversee the implementation of the ceasefire deal. It is now key to proceed to an agreement on all phases of this deal so as to ensure the release of all hostages and a permanent end of hostilities, which will allow planning for a more prosperous and secure day after for the whole region. Harrowing stories like Noah's or Siri Baiba's will echo for years. They remind us how urgent it is to immediately release all hostages and to make sure that what Noah described a few minutes ago never happens again. It reminds also that we need the ceasefire to hold and the conflict to end permanently. On the humanitarian front, the situation on the ground apparently remains alarming. Millions are in urgent need of primary health services, education, and shelter. Hence, the uninhibited and continuous flow of aid into all parts of Gaza should remain a priority. In this regard, we welcome the increase in the delivery of humanitarian aid following the ceasefire agreement, the reopening of the Rafah border crossing, and the reactivation of EU-BAM Rafah mission, in which Greece is pledging to participate. Mr. President, Greece is present in all efforts to alleviate the suffering of the people in Gaza. We have already welcomed, and we will continue welcoming injured children from Gaza for treatment to Greek hospitals. We also continue to send humanitarian aid to support Palestinian families, and through the Greek Orthodox Patriarchate of Jerusalem, the monastery of St. Porphyrios in Gaza has proven a safe haven of a big number of fellow human beings, both Christian and Muslims. We cannot change the past, but we can start laying the foundations for the future. Post-conflict planning, including governance, security, and reconstruction of the Gaza Strip, are also essential. The Palestinians should have a leading role in this process. Displacement of people would lead to instability in the whole region. The international community should continue assisting the Palestinian Authority, helping it addressing its immediate financial needs and implementing necessary reforms to promote good governance, strong institutions, and to ensure de-radicalization. The ceasefire agreement gives a much-needed impetus for the revitalization of the political process, the creation of a sovereign Palestinian state on the basis of a two-state solution according to the relevant Security Council resolutions, while recognizing the right of Israel to exist in peace and security. Sustainable peace is necessary to defeat extremism and radical forces in the whole region. Esteemed colleagues, with the Muslim holy month of Ramadan imminent, followed by Easter, which this year will be celebrated on the same day for all Christian denominations, we are reminded of the importance of the special status quo of the holy sites in Jerusalem and Bethlehem. Taking into consideration the universal importance of the holy sites, I wish to reaffirm Greece's deep interest in the preservation of the status quo. Mr. President, please allow me a few comments on the broader region concerning the current situation. New hope is emerging from Lebanon. Greece warmly welcomes the formation of a new government in Lebanon following the election of President Aoun and the appointment of Prime Minister Salam. The cessation of hostilities has also been a most welcome development, and we congratulate the United States and France on their contribution. Ensuring the long-term security of both Israeli and Lebanese citizens is the only path towards sustainable peace. The Lebanese armed forces being gradually deployed south of the Litani River and securing the safe return of the displaced to their homes are playing a very important role in the implementation of the provisions of the ceasefire agreement and Resolution 1701. Greece, as a non-permanent member of the UN Security Council, will be actively engaged in the discussions for the renewal of the UNIFIL's mandate in 2025, while participating for a long time in the naval part of the mission with a frigate. When it comes to Syria, security and prosperity are of acute importance for regional stability. Therefore, safeguarding the unity, sovereignty, and territorial integrity of Syria is a shared aspiration and a shared goal. I recently visited Damascus, where I had a comprehensive discussion with Interim President al-Sara and Foreign Minister Sabaini. I also participated in a ministerial meeting on Syria held in Paris. My message has been clear and consistent in all my engagements. We support a Syrian-led and Syrian-owned political transition in the spirit of UN Security Council Resolution 2254. This process should include all ethnic and religious communities, as well as Syrian political forces. It should also pave the way to a constitutional reform and fair elections with a view to a democratic, representative, inclusive, and non-sectarian government with no foreign interference. As the international community rushes to address Syria's needs after 14 years of civil war, so must Syria demonstrate its goodwill and fully respect its neighbors' sovereign rights in accordance with international law and especially international law of the sea. In my opinion, the process of returning to normality goes through the 4 pillars: gradual lifting of sanctions, institution building, reconstruction, and the return of Syrian migrants to their homes. Esteemed colleagues, let me just brief you on the regional maritime security and freedom of navigation in the Red Sea, both under extreme pressure, as the danger of a prolonged insecurity due to Houthi attacks still looms. Maritime security is a declared priority for our tenure at the Security Council. As a maritime nation and a leading force in the EU naval operation Aspides, Greece will contribute to upholding respect for maritime security, freedom of navigation, and protection of seafarers in full compliance with international law. Against this backdrop, and working closely with our partners, we call for a comprehensive and inclusive political settlement in Yemen under the auspices of the United Nations, the only pathway towards lasting regional peace and stability. Mr. President, as the region is undergoing profound changes, we must seize any positive momentum and spare no effort through this organization, its bodies and agencies, to help it shape in the form of more justice, more dignity, and peace for all peoples in the Middle East. I thank you.
I thank His Excellency Mr. Gerapi-Tritidis for his statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Slovenia.
Thank you, Mr. President. I want to thank Special Coordinator Kag, Ms. Kag, for her briefing and also for her very clear asks to us. I also want to thank Ms. Argamani and Mr. Levy for their contribution, really thought-provoking contributions. And Ms. Argamani, I'm extremely glad to see you here, to see you safe and free, and bringing us first-hand account of your horror experience in the captivity. Mr. President, after months of relentless devastation and suffering, the ceasefire in Gaza has finally offered hope and relief to the people on the ground and beyond in the region. Despite being long overdue and facing persistent challenges, a sustained ceasefire is our best chance at seeing peace in the Middle East. The ceasefire is bringing closer to hostages and their families. We follow with sense of relief hostages being reunited with their families, and with deep sadness the return of remains of those who have not survived. We offer our condolences to their families and loved ones. Dignified release of hostages remains one of our priorities. Even though many return only to the rubble of what was once their homes, the ceasefire is bringing hope to the people of Gaza, hope that life can be more than just suffering, hunger, and destruction. The humanitarian situation in the Strip requires our continued attention. Ensuring unobstructed humanitarian access and lifting remaining restrictions on essential items designated as dual use are crucial. This too remains our priority. Permanent ceasefire is the first step to lasting peace and the two-state solution. In the words of Ms. Kag, it is the last chance to achieve two-state solution, the endgame for this Council for more than 70 years. It is therefore not possible to simply go back to the status quo before the start of the Gaza war. The unspeakable devastation and suffering of civilians in this war makes it clear why full implementation of Security Council Resolution 2735 and the agreement reached through mediation is crucial. We continue to support our partners, Egypt, Qatar, and the United States, in facilitating the progress towards a permanent ceasefire, including through swift negotiations of the second phase. We agree with you, Ms. Argamani. The deal must go on. And it is essential that all parties respect the terms of the agreement to preserve the ceasefire and to implement it in full. We underline our utmost concern over any proposal for relocation of Gazans. This Council has clearly rejected any attempts at demographic or territorial change of Gaza in its Resolution 2735, adopted on the proposal of the United States. Gaza belongs to Gazans, and it is an integral part of the Palestinian state. Palestinians should decide their own future in line with the principle of self-determination. We recognize that the task of recovery and reconstruction of Gaza will be enormous and will require a joint international endeavor. We welcome and support the leadership exerted by our Arab partners. We are profoundly concerned over the situation in the West Bank, including civilian deaths, forced displacement, intensified operations, settler violence, movement restrictions, and settlement expansions. These operations further exacerbate tensions on the ground. International law and the decisions of international courts must be respected. Slovenia calls for the full respect of the status quo of all holy sites. Upcoming religious holidays must represent an opportunity for reflection, and we appeal for appropriate conditions for peaceful celebration. Slovenia resolutely supports the two-state solution, with Israel and Palestine living side by side in peace and security. In this solution, we see the Palestinian Authority as an indispensable partner, which should be supported, encouraged to continue on their reform path, and eventually assume their full responsibilities. Until then, we agree with Mr. Levy, UNRWA remains irreplaceable, preventing a governance vacuum and ensuring stability. Mr. President, while peace seems to be a big word, It essentially boils down to everyday decisions to work for it. There are many more steps to be made for a lasting peace to persist in the Middle East, yet the firm support of the international community and of this Council to the ceasefire and the tangible results we have seen in recent weeks confirm that this is the right path to pursue. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Slovenia for the statement, and I'll give the floor to the representative of the UK.
Thank you, President. And I'd like to start by thanking Acting Special Coordinator Karg for her briefing, also Mr. Levy. And I extend special thanks to Noah Argamani for the courage you have shown, the kindness you showed to Ela and Emily, and the bravery sharing your story with us today. I echo the remarks of Coordinator Karg in support of the remaining hostages and extend our condolences to those who mourn the dead and the missing. We welcome the return of hostages during Phase 1 after an appalling ordeal, and we call for the release of all the remaining hostages, including Avinatan Orr, who also has links to the UK. We mourn the death of Oded Lifshitz, who had strong links to the UK, and we strongly condemn the vile killing of the Bibas family and the lack of dignity provided to deceased hostages. We support all work, all efforts to hold to account Hamas, the PIJ, and other terrorists who kidnapped so many innocents on the 7th of October. And I recall that this Council has called for the immediate and unconditional release of all hostages in all 4 of our resolutions since the 7th of October, and I repeat that call today. The ceasefire agreement reached on the 16th of January marked a crucial first step towards ending the devastation and suffering in Gaza and achieving a sustainable peace. We're calling for 3 things. First, Palestinian civilians should be able to return home and rebuild their lives. The people of Gaza have suffered unimaginable horrors, with over 46,000 people killed and homes and lives destroyed. The UK supports regional efforts to cohere around a single plan for the next phase and reconstruction in Gaza. These plans should be Palestinian-led, with the PA front and centre, along with a strong role for civil society. Second, we welcome the improvement in aid supplies since the ceasefire agreement. But make no mistake, the humanitarian situation remains dire. We still need to see a sustained increase in the volume and types of goods reaching civilians, especially shelter and medical items. There can be no backsliding on this. We call for an urgent update to the dual-use list to allow essential supplies in and for commercial deliveries to be reinstated. The ceasefire has demonstrated the central role of the UN and humanitarian actors, including UNRWA. However, the humanitarian space is tightening, with ongoing visa restrictions and legislative proposals impacting NGOs. So we call on Israel to continue to work with the UN and partners to ensure aid reaches people in need. Third, the UK is seriously concerned at the expansion of Israel's operations, killing and displacing civilians in the West Bank. We recognise Israel's right to defend itself, but it must show restraint and ensure its conduct is proportionate. Restrictions on Palestinian movement in the West Bank are excessive. These fuel further instability and jeopardise the prospects for long-term peace. President, in conclusion, we urge all parties to sustain the ceasefire deal, implement the agreement in full, and support efforts to move to phase 2. For the hostages and their families, for Gazan civilians, and for all the Israeli and Palestinian people who deserve a peaceful and secure future on the basis of a two-state solution. I thank you.
I thank the representative of the UK for the statement, and I'll give the floor to the representative of Pakistan.
Thank you, Mr. President. We thank Special Coordinator Sigrid Kaag for her comprehensive briefing. I think it was a grim, rather grave picture that she presented. She spoke of trauma, the fragility of the situation, and what she termed as perhaps a last chance for a two-state solution. And we think that your 4 key requests merit full support of this Council. We have also carefully noted the observations made by the CSO briefers. Human suffering, power asymmetry, root causes, occupation, apartheid, international law, and accountability were the key words there. Mr. President, the war in Gaza has brought an unfathomable human tragedy. Over 47,000 Palestinians, mostly women and children, have been killed. More than 90% of Gaza's infrastructure, homes, businesses, hospitals, and places of worship has been reduced to rubble. This is not just destruction. It is an assault on an entire people's existence. The scale of suffering demands not just our sympathy, but decisive action. After 15 months of relentless killing and devastation, the ceasefire brokered by Egypt, Qatar, and the United States offers a fleeting moment of relief. Pakistan welcomes this diplomatic breakthrough and commends the mediators. Yet we must not mistake this pause in violence for peace. The situation remains precarious. Delay in releasing Palestinian prisoners risks derailing the process, prolonging suffering and undermining trust in future agreements. The ceasefire must be honored in full and must lead to a permanent cessation of hostilities. But even if the guns have fallen silent in Gaza, a deeper crisis persists. Peace cannot take root as long as Israel's actions in the occupied West Bank continue with impunity. Over 50,000 Palestinians have been forcibly displaced, the largest mass expulsion since 1967. Military raids, settler violence, and illegal land annexations intensify daily. These are not isolated incidents, but part of a deliberate strategy to erase Palestinian identity from their own land. It is ethnic cleansing in real time. If this Council is serious about peace, it should ensure that the ceasefire extends beyond Gaza to all occupied Palestinian territories. To move beyond this perpetual cycle of violence and destruction, the international community must prioritize the pursuit of a just and lasting peace. In our view, it should entail the following. First, full and immediate implementation of the ceasefire, ensuring a permanent cessation of hostilities, Israeli withdrawal from Gaza, unrestricted humanitarian access, and a comprehensive reconstruction plan for Gaza which will need to be supported by the international community and led and owned by the Palestinians. Pakistan fully supports the call for the enforcement of this Council's Resolution 2735. A ceasefire that does not lead to a sustainable peace will only delay the next catastrophe. Second, an end to Israel's aggression in the West Bank. The destruction of refugee camps in Jenin, Tulkarem, Nur al-Shams, and Al-Farah mirrors the devastation in Gaza. Forced displacements and illegal annexations must be reversed in line with Resolutions 2720 and 2334 of this Council. The legal and historical status of Al-Haram al-Sharif, Al-Aqsa Mosque must be upheld. It is clear that stability cannot be achieved through continued occupation and oppression. Third, UNRWA must be allowed to operate without obstruction. Israel has a legal duty under Article 2.5 of the UN Charter to facilitate its work. General Assembly's Resolution 79232 reinforces this obligation and condemns all attempts to hinder humanitarian aid. The deliberate targeting of aid agencies is a moral outrage and a violation of international law. Humanitarian relief cannot be allowed to be weaponized. Fourth, we must revive a credible, irreversible political process that leads to the establishment of a Palestinian state. Full UN membership for Palestine is not a symbolic gesture. It is a legal and moral imperative. The June conference, to be co-chaired by France and Saudi Arabia, presents an important opportunity for peace that must be seized and fully supported by all of us through concrete actions and support for the Palestinian Authority. And let us be clear, peace cannot and must not be allowed to be dictated by the occupier. It must be grounded in justice, international law, and the inalienable right of the Palestinian people to self-determination. The upcoming Emergency Arab League Summit in Cairo, to be followed by the OIC Foreign Ministers meeting in Jeddah, are expected to provide crucial guidance on addressing the dire situation in Gaza and the broader Palestinian question. Leaders will reaffirm solidarity with Palestine and send a resolute message rejecting any attempts to forcibly displace the Palestinian people or alter the status of the occupied territories. This Council must continue to stand firmly against forced displacement and annexation. A just peace demands more than diplomatic declarations. It requires enforcement, accountability, a rejection of impunity, and pressure on the occupying power to comply with UN resolutions and international legitimacy. The right of return for Palestinian refugees and the realization of a sovereign, independent, and contiguous Palestine are not mere aspirations. They are the foundation of any lasting peace in the region. Within this broader struggle for justice, we must also keep in mind the human suffering, as we have also heard today. We cannot forget the thousands of Palestinian prisoners languishing in Israeli custody, arbitrarily detained, tortured, and held in inhumane conditions. They suffer in silence. Some have perished due to mistreatment and medical neglect. These are war crimes. The world cannot afford selective morality. Double standards on human rights only embolden injustice and perpetuate the conflict. Israel's illegal occupation of the Arab territories is at the core of the turmoil in the Middle East. Full implementation of this Council's resolutions with regard to Syria, Lebanon, and Palestine is imperative for a just and lasting peace in the region. Pakistan stands resolutely with the Palestinian people in their rightful struggle for self-determination, freedom, and statehood. A sovereign, independent, and contiguous state of Palestine based on pre-1967 borders with Al-Quds al-Sharif as its capital is not just a political necessity, it is a moral imperative. If we truly believe in the UN Charter principles, if we stand for justice, for the rule of law, for the fundamental right of all peoples to live in dignity, then we must act. Justice for Palestine cannot wait. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Pakistan. I give the floor to the representative of the Russian Federation.
Mr. President, we would like to thank the ad interim special coordinator for the Middle East peace process, Ms. Sigrid Kaag. We thank her for a detailed briefing on the situation in the region. And we listened very carefully to Daniel Levy and to Noor Argamani. What happened on the 7th of October 2023 and thereafter in Israel and in the Gaza Strip has created a completely new level of cruelty and a disproportional reaction to it. The death in captivity of 2 Israeli children whose bodies were last week transferred to their families in Israel leaves no one indifferent, no one who believes that the human life is priceless. And we are shocked by the death of 17,000 Palestinian children who were killed in Gaza during the escalation of the conflict. In January, Russia initiated a special meeting of Security Council on children in the light of what is happening in the Strip. Tens of thousands of children in the Strip were wounded or are missing. The children in Gaza continue suffering from a lack of humanitarian assistance, hunger, and disease. And behind each of these episodes, there is a huge human tragedy. We send our condolences to the families and loved ones of all children whose lives were lost in this horrible and absolutely unnecessary conflict. We grieve not just for them, but also of all those who have fallen in the course of this escalation. Cruelty should not beget cruelty. This endless and vicious circle of violence must end. Mr. President, many responsible members of the Council, including Russia, for the long 15 months of the conflict have tried to stop it and obtain a ceasefire. Because of the position taken by the Biden administration, which aligned itself with Israel in everything, we haven't been able to do this for a long time. And it was only on 19th of January this year that we saw a glimmer of hope, when finally an agreement came into effect between Israel and Hamas. The fact that they were just about to be obtained was something that the American mediators kept telling us since the moment the Security Council Resolution 2735 passed in last June. At the same time, they kept members of the Council from passing any outcome or signal which could have accelerated the process. The long-awaited ceasefire in Gaza resulted in the release of the first hostages, including a Russian national, Mr. Trufanov, and the release of the Palestinians detained in Israel. This deal also unblocked the humanitarian assistance to all those suffering and needy and opened the opportunity for upscaling the supplies. But those were the only reasons for joy and optimism. As we're nearing the end of the first phase, the concerns grow about its further implementation. We increasingly hear from both sides mutual accusations and violations of bad faith in the implementation of individual steps. At the same time, the opaque monitoring mechanism, unfortunately, could lead, obviously, to a stalling of efforts and creates a risk of destabilization and fresh violence.
Mr. President, we should not allow the situation to develop by itself and allow the war parties on both sides of this confrontation to sabotage it. And we count in this context also on a consistent stance of the new American administration, whose involvement at the final stage resulted in intangible steps. It's important to avoid any kind of provocation steps, both by the Israeli and Palestinian radicals, who can once again derail this process that came into being with such difficulty. In this context, we have growing concern about the continued crisis surrounding UNRWA, which entered a new acute stage after the Knesset laws, which violate Security Council resolutions, which ban the functioning of the agency on some sovereign territory of Israel. Taking the key role this body plays in humanitarian operations on the ground and comprehensive assistance to the Palestinians, undermining their work will worsen an already dire situation for the people in Gaza, East Jerusalem, and the West Bank. UNRWA doesn't have an alternative, and implementing its task in cases dismantled the occupying power, Israel would have to take them up. Nor should we forget the role that the agency plays in the Middle East settlement, in particular in the context of dealing with one of the key final status issues, namely the issue of Palestinian refugees. Mr. President, I think everyone understands that without the relaunching of a comprehensive peace settlement process on the basis of recognized international decisions, the region will continue teetering on the brink of a major war. We are, of course, certainly not diminishing the importance of sensitive agreements, but limiting ourselves to just that is not something that we should be doing, nor should we be proposing the decisions which are infringing the interest of one party and prioritizing the concerns of the other. It's important also to take into account the interests of all countries in the region and the key players who can contribute towards durable, lasting, and sustainable peace in the Middle East region. The Security Council, as a primary body to maintain international peace and security, also should consider the situation in the region not only through the lens of the most recent escalation in Gaza. We should not close eyes to the military operation by Israel in the West Bank, which is being conducted using heavy weaponry. Another dangerous destabilizing step here is a widening of the occupation area in the Syrian Golan Heights in Lebanon and the bans on the movement and return of the IDPs. Also, such obvious provocation as a combat overfly during the funeral of the Hezbollah Secretary General Nasrallah in Beirut. Furthermore, we shouldn't ignore the irresponsible statements made by politicians in West Jerusalem who are trying to claim that the deal wasn't there to have a ceasefire, a permanent ceasefire, and try to find a way out of an unprecedented and most serious crisis, but only to make sure that the Israeli hostages are returned. We, for our part, confirm our position of principle for making the ceasefire in Gaza a permanent and stable one, leading to the release of all hostages and detainees. We advocate a speediest possible return to the peace process on the recognized basis of having two states. We are convinced that without a just and lasting settlement, ensuring the legitimate hopes and aspirations of the Palestinians for their own state, we will not be able to spare the Middle East from new outbreaks of violence. And we do hope that this lesson has been very well and truly drawn by those who are working on further regional initiatives on the basis on the fragile but very important ceasefire in Gaza. I thank you.
I thank the representative of the Russian Federation, and I'll give the floor to the representative of Algeria.
Mr. President, at the outset, I would like to express my sincere gratitude to the Special Coordinator, Mrs. Sigrid Kaag, for her sober and insightful briefing. We also listened attentively to the representatives of civil society. The situation in the occupied Palestinian territories remains a source of grave concern, despite the reduction of violence observed in Gaza following the ceasefire agreement in January. Yet, the situation continues to be volatile, with ongoing oppression and escalating tensions in the West Bank. Without hope for a political horizon or a durable solution, the suffering of the Palestinian people may persist indefinitely. In this context, I would like to highlight the following key points. First, the ceasefire agreement must be fully implemented. This agreement provided a crucial window for the delivery of humanitarian aid. It allowed the people of Gaza to experience a temporary reprieve from unthinkable hardship. Algeria calls on all parties to uphold their commitments under the ceasefire agreement and adhere to their obligations under international humanitarian law. The ceasefire must be maintained in line with Resolution 2735, which emphasizes that the ceasefire will continue as long as negotiations are ongoing, and that the mediators will work to ensure these negotiations continue until all agreements are reached. For us, the return to hostilities is unacceptable. For us, the ceasefire must also be extended to the West Bank. Second, the destruction in Gaza is catastrophic, and the suffering of Palestinians continue even in the relative calm of recent weeks. The scale of needs is immense, and it requires a coordinated international response. A comprehensive plan for reconstruction is indispensable to ensure that Gaza recovers, to ensure that the Palestinian people remain on their ancestral land. In this regard, the role of United Nations agencies, especially UNRWA, is essential in providing the necessary support and resources for this monumental task. Third, having implemented its scorched earth policy in Gaza, the Israeli occupying power is now turning its focus to the West Bank, where the level of destruction, where the level of settler violence is alarmingly high, particularly in Tulkarem, in Jenin, and in Tobaz. This is coupled with aggressive settlement expansion and the daily demolition of Palestinian homes. It is clear that Israeli politicians are actively inciting violence in the West Bank to serve internal political agendas. Israeli finance minister declared that our goal for 2025 is to demolish more than what Palestinians are building in the West Bank. This is a direct assault on the prospect of peace and stability, on the prospect of the two-state solution. Fourth, the weakening of the Palestinian Authority is a dangerous path that threatens the very existence of the Palestinian national prospect, of the Palestinian national project. It is a deliberate strategy by the Israeli occupying power, which dreams of a land free of Palestinians, from the river to the sea. In this context, Algeria condemns the Israeli recent decision to seize $90 million of Palestinian tax revenues. This move further undermines the ability of the Palestinian Authority to govern and to fulfill its responsibilities. Algeria firmly believes that the Palestinian Authority must be empowered to carry out its duty across all occupying territories. Only by strengthening Palestinian legitimate governance can we pave the way for sustainable peace. Mr. President, for Algeria, there are no double standards. Every innocent life must be protected. This principle lies at the heart of international humanitarian law, which safeguards civilians, particularly women and children, during armed conflict. We believe in justice that knows no boundaries. No one is above the law, and no one should be granted impunity. It is imperative to establish an international commission to investigate all allegations related to the situation in the occupied Palestinian territories. Every innocent life lost must be thoroughly and independently investigated, and those responsible, whoever they are, must be held accountable. Nearly 18,000 children have been killed in Gaza. Do they deserve independent investigation and accountability? More than 8,000 innocent women have been killed in Gaza. Do they deserve independent investigation and accountability? Over 1,000 health workers have been killed in Gaza while performing their duties. Do they deserve independent investigation and accountability? More than 200 journalists have been killed in Gaza. Do they deserve independent investigation and accountability? Accountability and justice are essential to prevent the repetition of such horrors. To those who believe that the ceasefire ended the suffering of the people in Gaza, I say, you are mistaken. Just yesterday, 5 newborn babies froze to death in a hospital in Gaza City. This is cruel. It is unacceptable. And it will remain forever a stain in the conscience of humanity. Mr. President, the Palestinian people will not forget their land. The Palestinian people will not relinquish their right, and they will not cease the struggle for freedom. Occupation will never be accepted. Abnormal situations can never be normalized. Therefore, the international community must address the root cause of the suffering, I mean, the illegal occupation. And the ceasefire agreement should serve as the foundation of a comprehensive and durable peace plan under international law. We have no more time to waste. The ruling of the ICG and the General Assembly resolution ES 1024 are clear. The Israeli occupation of Palestinian territories should be brought to an end. The international meeting to be held next June is an opportunity that we must seize for an irreversible path toward the establishment of a Palestinian state in the boundaries of June 1967. As President Abdelmajid Tebboune rightly stated, and I quote, "It is our duty to unite our efforts, to reinforce our resolve, and to ensure that Palestinians attain their rightful reality promised to them by international law in full and without conditions." End of quote. This reality is the establishment of a sovereign Palestinian state with Al-Quds Sharif as its capital. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of Algeria for their statement. I now give the floor to Denmark.
Thank you, Mr. President. And let me also thank Special Coordinator Kaag, Ms. Akamani, and Mr. Levy for their substantive and useful briefings. Colleagues, for decades, the international community has discussed the Israeli-Palestinian question, determined to reach a lasting peace through a two-state solution. This remains as urgent as ever. Mr. President, the first month of the ceasefire has brought much needed relief to the Israeli people and the civilian population of Gaza. We urge all parties to do their utmost to uphold this ceasefire and ensure its full implementation. As we've heard here today, the suffering of the innocent people who were taken hostage by Hamas on October 7 has been immense. It is hard to fully comprehend the terror they have endured. I thank Ms. Agamani for sharing her shocking experience and her perspective with us today. It takes much courage and strength to do so. Let me be clear. As stated many times before, we condemn the terrorist actions of Hamas and reiterate our call for all remaining hostages to be released immediately and without conditions. This must be done in a private, dignified, and safe manner. We regret that this has not been the case so far. Our condolences go to the grieving families whose loved ones tragically did not make it out alive. And our thoughts are with those who are still waiting to be reunited with loved ones, including you, Ms. Agamani. Mr. President, the ceasefire is saving lives, and the humanitarian consequences of the resumption of hostilities are simply unconscionable. We must do all we can to avoid that, and for the ceasefire to continue and move to phase 2. We welcome the surge in humanitarian aid into Gaza, as well as the resumption of medical evacuations. There is now an urgent need for critical medical equipment to enter Gaza. More heavy machinery for removal of rubble and unexploded ordnance is also needed. We thank the UN and the humanitarian community, including UNRWA, for their tireless work to make this possible. Gaza now faces a daunting task of reconstruction. The international community must support these efforts. Denmark and the European Union stand ready to do so within the proper framework. We note in this regard the active role taken by Egypt and other countries of the region in developing a comprehensive plan for Gaza's early recovery and reconstruction. We hope that these and other efforts can lead to a better future for the civilian population of Gaza, who have long suffered from Hamas' brutal leadership and devastating consequences of war over the past 16 months. Mr. President, in the West Bank, including East Jerusalem, we are deeply concerned by the escalating violence and large-scale security operations. We recognize the legitimate security concerns of Israel and the need to combat terrorism. However, we reiterate that security operations should be carried out in accordance with international law, including international human rights law. We are deeply alarmed by the continuing expansion of illegal Israeli settlements, the drastic increase in settler violence, as well as extensive movement restrictions. We recall that the settlements are illegal under international law and undermine the prospects for a two-state solution. The continuous settler violence must stop and perpetrators held accountable. Mr. President, recent attempts to forcibly enter and close down UNRWA schools in East Jerusalem, challenging Palestinian children's right to education, are deeply concerning. UNRWA has a unique mandate to provide state-like services to millions of Palestinians. Services UNRWA delivers until they eventually can be handed over to Palestinians. Hindering this mandate risks undermining the prospects of a two-state solution. We further emphasize the importance of reforming and revitalizing the Palestinian Authority to be able to effectively exercise their governance and security responsibilities in the West Bank. Together with the EU, we will continue to support the Palestinian Authority along its path of reform. Meanwhile, we call on Israel to release the withheld clearance revenues. In conclusion, Mr. President, the Middle East is at a crossroads. After immense suffering, death, and destruction, we must deliver lasting peace to the peoples of Israel and Palestine. A peace with security and dignity, as mentioned by the Special Coordinator. The formula for this is well known. It is the realization of two states, Israel and Palestine, living side by side in peace and security. Denmark remains fully committed to this goal. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Denmark for her statement. Now I give the floor to Republic of Korea.
Thank you, Mr. President. At the outset, I would like to thank Special Coordinator Sigrid Kaag and Mr. Daniel Levy for their briefings. In particular, I would like to thank Ms. Noah Argamani for her testimonies. I believe everyone in this chamber takes your testimony very seriously and understands clearly and loud the message you want to convey today. Mr. President, for the last month, Israelis and Palestinians, as well as the entire world, have been witnessing what firm political will can bring to the region. Family members of Israeli hostages, brutally and unjustifiably held by Hamas for more than a year, have finally reunited with their loved ones. Palestinian prisoners were also freed by Israelis. Hundreds of trucks now enter Gaza every day, and law and order there has been improved. Now is the time to think about a peaceful tomorrow. And it is clear that in order to prepare for those next days, beneficial to both Israelis and Palestinians, the current ceasefire deal must be extended to the second phase. Thus, we encourage both parties to faithfully engage in negotiations for these vital transitions, focusing on the pains of long-suffering hostages' families and Palestinian civilians in Gaza. Millions of lives hang in the balance. Innocent human beings must hold more weight than all other parochial political interests. To this end, we call on the parties to the conflict to sincerely implement the current phase of the ceasefire, hostage release agreement, with the utmost commitment. We share the emotional devastation of Israelis in finding out that one of the bodies retrieved last Thursday was not the expected hostage. Hamas must exert every effort to return all hostages, both living and dead, with dignity. To the family members, Israel must also abide by the agreed conditions of the deal and guarantee the entry of essential humanitarian aid, including medical equipment and shelters, and materials for recovery into Gaza. Temporary medical evacuations should also be ensured for those in need. We appreciate in this regard the ongoing efforts by mediators, US, Qatar, and Egypt, and believe that those countries will continue their utmost efforts to encourage the parties to reach a fruitful outcome soon. Mr. President, the ceasefire in Gaza must serve as a stepping stone for durable stability in Israel, Palestine, and beyond. In this regard, we remain deeply concerned about the current situation in the West Bank, including Israel's military operations, demolition of Palestinian homes, and violence by settlers against Palestinian civilians and their property. We are also concerned by OCHA and UNRWA's report that Palestinian access to education has been seriously undermined by restrictions and physical attacks on schools. We call on Israel to remain committed to all international obligations, such as the protection of civilian infrastructure and inviolability of UN facilities, including UNRWA schools. We also call on Israel to ensure the accountability of illegal actions by its nationals, including settlers. Furthermore, the ongoing Israeli presence in Lebanon and Syria does not pave the way for sustainable peace. Rather, it fosters hostility, undermines the new government, empowers armed groups, and erodes regional trust. We call on all parties to uphold international obligations to support regional stability and peace. Mr. President, for more than a year, we borne witness to the extreme suffering of both Israelis and Palestinians, including children. The harrowing return of small lifeless bodies of the Bibas brothers last week reminded us once again that the current confrontation resulting in endless agony should be put to an end at the earliest time possible. Far too many children have died. In order to obtain a lasting solution, illegitimate aspirations and the security concerns of both Israelis and Palestinians should be fully considered based on the two-state solution. Noting the multiple suggestions for recovery and reconstruction in Gaza are being discussed in the international community, we hope the sincere discussions will lead to a viable, right-based plan for full reconstruction in Gaza, in line with international law. The Republic of Korea, as a member of the Security Council, will keep engaging in this process. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative AOK for the statement, and I'll give the floor to Guyana.
Thank you, Mr. President. I thank Acting Coordinator Ms. Sigrid Kaag for her briefing and have taken careful note of the perspectives offered by Mr. Levy. I commend Ms. Argamani for her bravery during her harrowing ordeal in Gaza and thank her for sharing her experience with us today. Mr. President, Guyana has been closely following the developments in the occupied Palestinian territory. The pressing questions for us, as for many member states, concern the continued implementation of the ceasefire in Gaza and the end of the violence in the occupied West Bank. On both fronts, strong diplomatic efforts are required given the negative trends that we are seeing. This Council must exert every effort to ensure that the parties continue the negotiations toward a permanent ceasefire. In the same vein, it is imperative for the Council to take action to stop the spiraling violence being perpetrated by the occupying power in the occupied West Bank, including East Jerusalem. Mr. President, we have seen the respite afforded hundreds of thousands of Palestinians through the implementation of the first phase of the ceasefire in Gaza. We have taken note, for example, that over 57,000 metric tons of food was brought into Gaza since the ceasefire, supporting more than 1.8 million people with full rations of food parcels. Notwithstanding some improvements, we are concerned that thousands still cannot access adequate shelter. Many sick and seriously wounded are unable to access the care they need owing to a decimated healthcare system. The situation is exacerbated by the rate of denial of the relevant authorizations for persons, particularly children, requiring medical evacuation to other countries. The continued characterization of certain critical items as dual use adds to the humanitarian strain that many Palestinians are still enduring. We regret that as Palestinians are experiencing immense suffering, the lifeline they have found in UNRWA has been taken away. This has happened despite decisions taken by member states of the United Nations for the agency to continue implementing its mandate as established by the General Assembly. We again call on Israel to abide by its charter obligations to ensure that the UN's work, including that of UNRWA, is not hindered in the occupied Palestinian territory. Guyana urges the parties to fully abide with their obligations under international law, including international humanitarian law and human rights law. We call for the unconditional and dignified release of all hostages and Palestinians detained in Israel without charge. Guyana also emphasizes the obligations to treat hostages and detainees with respect and dignity, and stresses that they should be allowed visits by the Red Cross. We have followed closely the matter involving the Bibas family that was taken hostage on 7th October. We are saddened that all those taken hostages were not released alive to Israel. There must be full accountability for all the atrocities perpetrated during this war, including for the taking of hostages, the killing of civilians, the forced displacement of hundreds of thousands of persons, and for the use of starvation as a weapon of war. Mr. President, it is critical that the ceasefire in Gaza continues to hold. and we urge the parties to prioritize the lives of civilians as they negotiate the remaining phases of the ceasefire agreement. Gaza must not be plunged again into war after 15 months of death and destruction. While our eyes are on the fragile ceasefire in Gaza, the threat of an inferno in the occupied West Bank is real, and many of the same patterns observed as the Gaza war developed are now being witnessed in the West Bank. Guyana urges the Council to work collectively to prevent further displacement, death, and destruction in the occupied West Bank. The cumulative effect of Israel's continued violent occupation of the Palestinian territories is the systematic undermining of the two-state solution and entrapment of the Palestinian people in a cycle of violence and poverty. Israel's operations in the occupied West Bank, for example, negatively impact the capacity of the Palestinian Authority to govern the area. We urge the international community to continue supporting a lasting, just, and comprehensive solution of the Palestinian question in line with the two-state solution. Israel's settlement policies and practices must end. It must adhere to its obligations to bring its occupation of the Palestinian territories to a swift end in line with the advisory opinion of the International Court of Justice and General Assembly Resolution ES 1024. I reiterate 3 appeals. First, there must be a permanent ceasefire in Gaza to create the conditions for Palestinians to rebuild their lives. Simultaneously, the hostilities in the occupied West Bank must cease. Second, all efforts aimed at resolving the Palestinian question should align with the two-state solution and help to advance it. Third and final, respect for international law should be the guiding principle that governs actions on the Palestinian question. I conclude, Mr. President, by emphasizing Guyana's unwavering solidarity with the Palestinian people and our commitment to contributing positively to the quest for a comprehensive, just, and lasting solution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Guyana for the statement, and I'll give the floor to the representative of Somalia.
Mr. President, at the outset, I would like to thank Special Coordinator Ms. Sigrid Kaag for her informative briefing and for her continued efforts to facilitate mediation and humanitarian assistance in Gaza. And we express our appreciation for the vital role of the United Nations and the regional partners in order to promote peace and stability in the region, in particular in light of the current challenges. We have listened carefully to the briefings by the speakers today, and we welcome the prisoner exchange that has taken place lately, and we consider it a positive measure in order to build trust between the parties, and we call for the full commitment to international law in implementing the measures. Mr. President, the ceasefire deal is a decisive step towards ending the hostilities and alleviating the suffering of the civilians in Gaza. We urge the parties to fulfill their commitments as per the ceasefire and to refrain from anything that threatens the truce. This ceasefire deal must be a basis for a sustained peace in a manner that guarantees protection of civilians and providing urgent humanitarian assistance. In this context, we call for the transition from phase 1 to phase 2 of the ceasefire, so that the ceasefire continues and leads to a sustained peace. All military operations in the occupied Palestinian territory must end, in particular in the West Bank and East Jerusalem. The continued attacks and the illegal arrests and the settlement expansion and the excessive use of force all undermines the spirit of the ceasefire deal and impedes the efforts of mediation that seeks to preserve the stability. The international community must condemn these violations clearly, and all parties must commit to the highest degree of restraint to prevent escalation. The mediation efforts will not succeed if the aggression continues unchecked. Mr. President, the next phase must include comprehensive measures to facilitate reconstruction, especially rebuilding the health sector in Gaza. The medical facilities have suffered great damage, leaving thousands without access to health care. We emphasize also the need to guarantee the free and uninterrupted flow of humanitarian assistance into Gaza without characterizing life-saving items as dual-use items. Humanitarian assistance must be fully neutral and free from politicization. We also emphasize the need to establish a central mechanism for medical evacuation to guarantee access to urgent medical treatment. Healthcare is a fundamental human right, and all efforts must be implemented to secure safe medical evacuation. Mr. President, we have been following with great concern the recent restrictions imposed by the Israeli authorities against UNRWA. UNRWA is the lifeline of humanitarian assistance in Gaza. They provide vital assistance, healthcare, education for millions of Palestinians. Banning UNRWA's operations increases the humanitarian crisis and prevents vulnerable segments from essential services. And despite these challenges, the collective support for UNRWA is necessary so that we can guarantee the continued services, education and health services for millions of Palestinians. We urge the international community to support UNRWA in order to guarantee its continued effective operations and life-saving services for Palestinian refugees. In conclusion, Mr. President, the people of Gaza, as have all Palestinians, have suffered decades of suffering and persecution. It's time for serious work for the sake of a lasting peace that preserves justice and rights and dignity for all. We call on the international community to continue supporting diplomatic efforts and to engage for the sake of reconstruction and providing humanitarian assistance to guarantee a future of hope and stability. This fair and lasting solution is based on the principles of self-determination and the right of return. The Palestinian people must not be deprived of their legitimate aspirations in sovereignty, dignity, and security. Any peace initiative must address these fundamental rights represented in the establishment of a sovereign, independent Palestinian state on the borders of 1967, with East Jerusalem as its capital, and must guarantee the right of refugees to return home as per the General Assembly Resolution 194. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of Somalia for the statement, and I'll give the floor to the representative of Sierra Leone.
President, I thank Special Coordinator Sigrid Kaag for her valuable update on the overall situation in the Middle East, particularly regarding the status of the implementation of the ceasefire agreement in the Gaza Strip and the ongoing escalation in the West Bank. I also thank Mr. Daniel Levy for his contribution. A special thank you to Ms. Noah Agamani for her personal testimony and call for action, which we must heed. At the outset, Sierra Leone is encouraged by the steady progress in implementing the ceasefire agreement between Israel and Hamas, which took effect in January this year. This first phase provides an opportunity for the conflicting parties to fulfill their obligations under international law and humanitarian law, ensuring the protection of civilians and civilian infrastructure. We're encouraged by the renewed sense of relief and optimism that the pause in hostilities brings to civilians in the Gaza Strip and to the hostages held by Hamas since October 2023, despite the uncertainty that still looms. We urge all parties to uphold the terms of the agreement and demonstrate even greater political will and commitment as they proceed to the next phase of negotiations. Sierra Leone will continue to express its full support for the mediators and their steadfast dedication to the process. It is our hope that this pause will lead to a permanent end to the conflict and a lasting ceasefire extending throughout the entire occupied Palestinian territory. Mr. President, we have taken note of the letter from the permanent representative of Israel to the United States, dated February 21, 2025, concerning the tragic case of the Baibas family. The tragedy of all affected families behoves the conflicting parties and leadership to commit to the full implementation of the ceasefire agreement. As we extend our deepest sympathies to all victims, including the hostages and their families, we reiterate our call for investigations into allegations of abuses against hostages, prisoners, and for accountability for the grave crimes committed in the context of the conflict in Gaza and ongoing occupation of Palestine. In the context of the release of hostages and prisoners, we recognize the critical role of the International Committee of the Red Cross. We also commend the humanitarian workers on the ground who are providing urgent assistance to the thousands of civilians returning to rebuild their homes. Sierra Leone, however, remains concerned by the operational and administrative challenges faced by UNRWA as it strives to meet the needs of the population in the occupied Palestinian territory. We reiterate our call for UNRWA to be allowed to continue its operations as it remains a vital lifeline for the Palestinian people. Mr. President, reports from the West Bank are deeply troubling, with over 40,000 civilians displaced after weeks of sustained violence and destruction. Sierra Leone is gravely concerned about the ongoing military operations in the areas surrounding Jenin, Tol Karim, and Tubas, as well as the arrest and detention of civilians and the severe restrictions on movement that are endangering the safety and livelihoods of Palestinian civilians. We're equally concerned about the increasing violence from settlers and clashes between armed Palestinians and Israeli forces. At this juncture in our efforts towards a peaceful resolution of the Palestinian issue, Sierra Leone wishes to emphasize the following points. First, the surge in humanitarian assistance must be sustained, and humanitarian actors should be granted unimpeded access across the Gaza Strip and the West Bank. We support the call for humanitarian experts for increased commercial activity to reduce civilian dependence on humanitarian aid and to revitalize the local economy. We also stress the urgent need for Israeli authorities to approve the entry of items deemed as dual-use items for medical purposes and to expedite the approval processes for the evacuation of children and other patients requiring specialized medical treatment. Second, we recognize the importance of early recovery and reconstruction efforts in Gaza, which are crucial for rebuilding lives and institutions that will help safeguard peace and secure the future of Palestinians. Both the Gaza Relief and Early Recovery Plan and the Gaza and West Bank Interim Rapid Damage and Needs Assessment offer valuable strategies in this regard. Third, the international community must continue to strengthen the political framework for a two-state solution that ensures the self-determination of the Palestinian people based on international law and relevant United Nations resolutions. Over the years, it has become clear that only a diplomatic and political resolution can bring lasting peace, and the Israel-Palestine conflict is no exception. We look forward to participating in the upcoming international conference under the auspices of the UN in June. In conclusion, Mr. President, it is imperative that the parties prioritize peace and continue to uphold and implement the ceasefire agreement, and we collectively remain steadfast in our commitment to resolving the long-standing conflict between Israel and Palestine. Only through sustained dialogue, adherence to international law, and a collective will to achieve a peaceful resolution can we ensure a future of security, dignity for both Israel and Palestine, and self-determination for the Palestinian people. The international community must continue its efforts to support a just and lasting solution, grounded in the principles of peace and justice for both Israelis and Palestinians. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Sierra Leone. I give the floor to the representative of France.
Monsieur le Président,
Mr. President, I thank the Special Coordinator and Mr. Levy for their briefings. I also thank Ms. Noa Argamani for speaking to us. France was quite moved and deeply saddened at seeing the remains of Shiri Bibas and her two children, Ariel and Kefir, as well as that of Odette Lifshitz. France extends its sincere condolences to their families and to their loved ones, and we were outraged to learn that Hamas initially had not returned the body of Shiri Bibas to her loved ones. That is an unspeakable act. France reiterates its unwavering solidarity with the families of all the hostages. We are thinking in particular of the loved ones of our compatriot Ohad Halomi, who is still being detained, and we stand with the Israeli people following the barbaric terrorist attacks committed by Hamas on the 7th of October 2023, which we have condemned. This is the worst anti-Semitic attack and massacre since the Shoah. France will continue to act tirelessly to ensure the release of all hostages. The maintenance of a ceasefire is essential. France calls on the parties to fully respect the ceasefire agreement after many months of shelling and civilian victims in Gaza. Discussions on the extension must begin, and the flow of humanitarian aid must be ramped up, and the displaced must be able to return home. France supports the efforts of the U.S., Qatar, and Egypt to facilitate talks. In support of the ceasefire, France has deployed specialized personnel to the Rafah crossing point within the framework of UBAM Rafah. Access to the Gaza Strip must be ensured by Israel for humanitarian actors, and their work must be facilitated in accordance with IHL. We reiterate our support for the essential action of UNRWA and of all humanitarian actors. The situation in the West Bank is quite disturbing. France calls on the Israeli authorities to show greater restraint and to comply with international humanitarian law and ensure the protection of the civilian population. The settlements are illegal, and settlement activity must end. And the violence carried out by settlers must also end as well. Mr. President, it is time for the Council to take up the issue of the future of the Gaza Strip and its reconstruction. We condemn any forced displacement of the Palestinian population. This would run counter to international law, and it would be dangerous for stability in the region. We support Egypt's efforts and the efforts of the Arab group to draft a plan for the day after and for the rebuilding of Gaza. The Palestinian Authority must be able to govern throughout the Palestinian territories. Hamas cannot be part of the solution. The future of Gaza cannot be delinked from a comprehensive political settlement in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. France recalls its commitment to the irreversible process of an effective implementation of the two-state solution with security guarantees for Israelis and Palestinians. This is the only way to ensure just and lasting peace. With that in mind, France will co-chair in June 2025 with Saudi Arabia an international conference for the implementation of the two-state solution here in New York. Thank you.
I thank the representative of France, and I give the floor to the representative of Panama.
Muchas gracias, señor presidente.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. Panama welcomes the holding of this meeting, and we are grateful to Ms. Sigrid Kaag
for briefing us on the situation in the Middle East and in Gaza. We also welcome the briefings of the, we also welcome rather the Observer State of Palestine, Israel and Kuwait at this meeting. And we are also grateful for the briefings provided by Ms. Noa Argamani, truly a tragic story, and we thank Mr. Daniel Levy as well for their sincerity. Once again, Panama firmly condemns the atrocious terrorist attacks on the 7th of October 2023 perpetrated by Hamas. Those acts unleashed the current conflict. It is important for the parties faithfully to comply with the agreements, and we reaffirm our robust support for the right of the people of Israel to live in peace and security within recognized borders. At the same time, we underscore the need for a solution which will ensure peaceful coexistence between Israelis and Palestinians. This Council's resolutions underscore the importance of implementing resolution provisions applicable in the current context, particularly in the face of persistent challenges impacting the civilian population and humanitarian assistance. Regrettably, the situation on the ground continues to worsen in some areas. In the West Bank, some actions on the ground continue to lead to despair and suffering for the population. The expansion of settlements continues to change the dynamics on the ground, and this is exacerbating tensions and make any possibility of stability even more difficult. In Gaza, the humanitarian crisis continues to reach alarming levels. More than 1.5 million people have been displaced. Healthcare centers have collapsed, and life-saving humanitarian aid continues to be blocked and cannot meet the urgent needs resulting from the crisis. The shortage of drinking water is further worsening the suffering of the population. While this crisis, humanitarian crisis, has increased the fragile ceasefire between Israel and Hamas, thanks to intensive diplomatic efforts, has held despite some setbacks, be they intentional or not, and these setbacks have complicated compliance by the parties with their obligations and threaten a serious risk of collapse. The current tension involving the release of Israeli hostages and Palestinian prisoners have undermined stability in the process and have threatened to unleash a new wave of violence. If this ceasefire fails, then the human toll will be incalculable, and prospects for regional peace and stability will fade further. We have frequently condemned categorically attacks perpetrated by Hamas. Israeli hostages cannot continue to be used as bargaining chips to exert pressure. The testimony that we've had from Noa Argamani here, it was a very moving testimony of her own personal experience. Such tragedies are unjustifiable. We thank her for her courage and the wisdom of her message. Hostages cannot be used as leverage in negotiations without any guarantees. Kidnapping, the display of them and using them as propaganda are a serious violation of IHL and must cease immediately. There's no justification, nor is there any context which allows them to be exploited in such a way. Panama underscores that trust must be built through political will and concrete actions and not through threats, and we urge the parties in the conflict to continue to promote diplomatic solutions to ensure the implementation of the agreements that have been reached, and so that sustainable peace can be achieved and urgent reconstruction can begin, so that we can restore trust. The cessation of hostilities alone will not resolve uncertainties about the future of Gaza, where humanitarian and institutional devastation require rebuilding and effective governance for lasting stability. The international community must go beyond ending violence and must address the conditions that have led to a prolongation of conflict. Mr. President, entire generations of Israelis and Palestinians have grown up under the shadow of violence, and children, rather than learning in school, have had to survive and have seen their childhoods cut short as a result of this never-ending conflict. Hundreds of thousands of lives have been taken away. These are not mere figures, not cold statistics. These are people with names, with pasts, with dreams that they will never fulfill, with families who mourn them and families who will be marked by the empty space they have left. Their deaths cannot be seen as an inevitable consequence of the conflict. Every one of them reminds us of the urgent need to find a solution to put an end to this suffering. And to those who have survived, who today live in the rubble of what they used to call home, as well as those who have been released after months of captivity, all of them deserve something basic: dignity. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Panama. I should now give the floor to the representative of the United States.
Thank you, Mr. President. Thank you, Special Coordinator Sigrid Kaag and Daniel Levy, for your briefings. And the United States wants to especially thank Noah Argamani for coming here today to provide such compelling testimony to the depravity of Hamas and what you endured. The United States stands with you and with all hostages, and we join other members of this council who have expressed condolences for those who lost loved ones, and to demand the release of those still in captivity, including your partner. At the outset, it is important to note that the United States continues our work with Qatar and Egypt to ensure full implementation of the ceasefire and hostage release deal. The depth of Hamas's cruelty knows no ends, and we are appalled and horrified by their desecration of the remains of Shiri Bibas. This is a gruesome scene, and we join the people of Israel in mourning the loss of several members of the Bibas family. Kafir was not even a year old when he was taken, along with his 4-year-old brother, Ariel. They were cruelly murdered by Hamas. We also mourn the loss of Oded Lifshitz, a lifelong peace activist whose remains were also returned to Israel. The only solace is that the remains can be returned to their families for proper burial. Despite the squalid conditions in which he was held, we are glad that American citizen Sagai Dekel Hen was released after nearly 500 days in captivity. That said, we must never forget the lives taken as a result of the brutal Hamas terrorist attack on October 7, 2023, and the horrors endured by countless innocent people in the war that followed as a result of Hamas's actions. Hamas still holds 63 hostages, including New Jersey native Idan Alexander, and the remains of 4 Americans murdered by Hamas in Gaza. The taking of hostages is a despicable, criminal act. All hostages must be released now. Mr. President, as President Trump has made clear, the future of Gaza must look different. We cannot rely on the tired ideas of the past and expect better results. Bold thinking is needed to avoid ending up in the exact same place: death, destruction, and instability, which is untenable for Israelis, Palestinians, and the region. We have seen Hamas cynically weaponize the suffering of Palestinians by using civilian infrastructure to store caches of weapons, house fighters, and coordinate attacks. As long as Hamas stands as a force that can govern, or as a force that can administer, or as a force that can threaten by use of violence, peace becomes impossible. Hamas must be eliminated. It must be eradicated. Any plan for reconstruction in Gaza must ensure Hamas is fully removed from power and held accountable for its October 7th terrorist massacre. We look forward to a plan from our Arab partners on the future of Gaza that reflects this vision. Mr. President, as Israel continues to balance its safety and security requirements, we recognize its efforts to facilitate the delivery of humanitarian aid to the people of Gaza. We urge countries to support this effort through additional funding to scale up much-needed aid. The United States reiterates, UNRWA is not and never has been the only option for providing humanitarian assistance in Gaza. UNRWA's work has been tainted and its credibility called into question due to the terrorist ties of its staff that were exposed during the October 7th attack. It was Israel's sovereign decision to close UNRWA's offices in Jerusalem based on conditions on the ground. Other UN agencies can and have done this work with appropriate safeguards to ensure assistance is not diverted, looted, or misused by terrorist groups. Turning to the wider region, Mr. President, we must acknowledge the Middle East continues to suffer from the nefarious influence of Iran, which continues to sow chaos. Behind every terrorist group like Hamas, behind every act of violence, behind every destabilizing activity, behind everything that threatens peace and stability for the millions of people who call this region home, is Iran. The United States will not allow Iran to manufacture or acquire nuclear weapons, through which the regime would seek to render itself immune from external pressure. As the result of the ceasefire, the countries of the Middle East have an historic opportunity to reshape their region in a way that affords its people a better path forward. An expansion of the Abraham Accords can lead to greater regional integration between Israel and its neighbors in a unified bloc to counter Iran and its state sponsorship of terror in Gaza, the West Bank, and throughout the region. The United States will do its part to create a more prosperous future for all of the region's people. I thank you.
I thank the representative of the U.S. for the statement. I shall now make a statement in my capacity as the representative of China. Colleagues, I thank Ms. Karg, the Special Coordinator at Interim for the briefing, and thank Mr. Levy for the statement. Ms. Agamani, thank you also for your briefing. I express my deep sympathy for your ordeal. The 15-month-long conflict has caused unimaginable suffering to civilians of both Palestine and Israel. We sincerely hope that all detainees will be released and reunited with their families as soon as possible, and that the 2 million conflict survivors in Gaza will not be plunged into war again. Thus, the Gaza ceasefire agreement must be fully and continuously implemented to ensure a permanent ceasefire. We are gravely concerned about the recent frequent violations of the ceasefire agreement and strongly call on parties concerned to fully implement the ceasefire agreement. In particular, the provisions on access of humanitarian aid and release of detainees, among others, must be implemented strictly, seriously, and in good faith. In this process, the dignity of all, including the deceased, should be respected. Negotiations on the second phase have been deferred. The international community should encourage and support the parties in moving ahead with the negotiations as soon as possible. Countries with major influence on parties, in particular, should play a role to that end. The massive Israeli attacks on the West Bank has lasted over a month, creating the largest displacement of Palestinians since 1967. Israel has also indicated It will maintain a long-term military presence in the West Bank. The situation continues to escalate. The developments are worrying. War must not be reignited in the West Bank. West Bank must not become the next Gaza. China calls on Israel to stop its military operations in the West Bank, cease the settlement expansion, and curb settler violence in earnest, and calls on all parties to work together for early de-escalation of the situation. Colleagues, the fundamental crux of the decades-old Palestinian issue lies in the failure to implement the two-state solution and to establish an independent state of Palestine. Gaza and the West Bank, including East Jerusalem, are all inalienable parts of the state of Palestine and the homeland of the Palestinian people, not bargaining chips for political deal-making. The post-war governance of Gaza must follow the principle of Palestinians administrate Palestine. The international community should provide support for the reconstruction of Gaza. The role of UNRWA in the humanitarian relief and post-war reconstruction of Gaza is irreplaceable, and its normal mandate delivery must be guaranteed. We call on the international community to step up its efforts to advance the political process of the two-state solution and to provide necessary guarantees to that end. Along with the international community, China will continue our unremitting efforts to restore peace in the Middle East and to achieve a comprehensive, just, and lasting solution to the question of Palestine. Thank you. I resume my function as President of the Council. And I'll give the floor to the permanent observer of the observer state of Palestine.
You have the floor.
Mr. President, we thank you for convening this meeting at this critical time. We also express our thanks to Special Coordinator Sigrid Kaag for her presentation and efforts, and Daniel Levy for his important briefing. We also acknowledge the presence and testimony of Noah Argamani and echo her calls for honoring the ceasefire. Mr. President, Israel's plan is clear in Gaza, in East Jerusalem, and in the rest of the West Bank. Get rid of Palestinian demography to seize Palestinian geography. It has this recurrent dream that it will end this conflict through the disappearance of the Palestinian people. That will never happen. It will not happen. We have often repeated, there is not a people too many in the Middle East. There is an independent state missing. The failed recipes of the past will never deliver a different future. Our history is filled with wars that Israel promised will be decisive, and they were not. Of mass forcible displacement that was supposed to end the Palestine question, and it did not. The idea that more injustice, more brutality, more oppression would lead to peace is madness. The idea that more killing, more maiming, more displacing will bring security is delusional. There is no military solution to this conflict, only a political one. As we sit here and speak, on the ground, Israel is trying to make sure that political solution, the only one that leads to peace, is not viable anymore. It is destroying the two-state solution in the hope to make its unlawful annexation of Palestinian land permanent. It continues entertaining the idea of emptying the Gaza Strip of its people through so-called voluntary migration, the code name for mass forcible displacement. It is conducting a large-scale military assault against the Palestinian people in the West Bank, notably against refugee camps, which has led to the largest displacement of Palestinian population there since 1967, with over 40,000 Palestinians displaced, and now stating it will not allow their return and intends to stay there for a year. While the Arab world are trying to find a way out of the hell Israel left behind in Gaza, Israel is unleashing hell in the West Bank. When we speak of the utter and wanton destruction of Gaza, of human tragedy and people's ordeal, of the devastation, of how Gaza was made unlivable, let us not forget Israel's responsibility as it deliberately spread destruction across all of Gaza with the very purpose of making it unlivable. Mr. President, there is only one way forward. Preserve the ceasefire in Gaza and ensure its full implementation in line with Council Resolution 2735, and end the escalation and aggression in the West Bank, leading to a permanent cessation of hostility. Ceasefire has to be permanent. Reconstruction of Gaza while its people remain in Gaza and while they participate and benefit from such reconstruction. The Palestinian government assumes its full responsibilities throughout the OPT and should be enabled and supported in this endeavor. A cessation of all the policies that entrench the occupation and conflict instead of ending them. Ending the occupation, achieving the independence of the State of Palestine, and implementing the two-state solution. Mr. President, enough bloodshed, enough agony, enough suffering. Let me repeat that. Enough bloodshed, enough agony, enough suffering. Israel has killed at least 50,000 Palestinians, maimed, displaced, arbitrarily arrested, tortured, and caused suffering for millions of Palestinians. Our children have been killed, amputated, orphaned, displaced, traumatized. This has to stop. It has to stop. We have seen in recent days another attempt by the Israeli government at dehumanizing the Palestinian people as a whole and at justifying the killing of our children. There can be no justification for harming children, for harming all children from everywhere. Israel killed thousands of Palestinian children, often in atrocious conditions. Liane Hamada, 15 years old, was with her mother, father, her 3 siblings, and her cousin in a car, evacuating from Gaza City in the morning. She called emergency services after her parents and her siblings were shot dead. And I quote, "They are shooting at us," she screamed. "They are shooting at us. The tank is next to me. We are inside the car, and the tank is next to us."
انت بابا جنبي انتوا متخبيين؟ في السيارة احنا جنبينا الدبابة انتوا جوا السيارة؟
Here is the recording as you heard it, her call. After this salvo of bullets, Layan went quiet. A few moments later, her 6-year-old cousin, Hind Rajab, picked up the phone. Let me show you her picture. She said to the dispatcher, "They are dead. I am in the car. The tank is next to me. It is moving. It is very, very close and moving. Talk to me. When someone can you hang up? Please come take me, please. It's almost night. The night is approaching. I am scared. Please come, take me." Listen to the voice of Hind Rajab and imagine her agony and the agony of her family and of thousands upon thousands of Palestinian families.
ميتين؟ وهم هلا بعد بالسيارة؟ ما بجنبية. الدبابة وين؟ جنبية. الدبابة جنبكم؟ عم تتحرك ولا واقف؟ نزل حدا منها؟ هي بتتحرك. تتحرك؟ هي بتتحرك جنب السيارة ولا هي جاي من ورا السيارة أو من قدام السيارة؟ من قدام السيارة. هي جاية عليكي من قدام السيارة الدبابة؟ قريب كتير؟ كتير. وعم تمشي؟ ما بدنا نخاف. انتي معي. أنا معك يا عمري. أنا معك. أنا معك ليجي حدا ياخدك، ما بدي أسيبك لحالك. لما يجي حدا بتفكري بيا؟ إيه؟ لما يجي حدا يكون بتفكري. لا أنا بدي معاكي.
I will stay with you to make sure you're okay. Stay with me, stay with me. Oh, sweetheart, I'm here with you. I will not leave you alone. Come, take me.
The dispatcher stayed on the phone with her, trying to reassure her, "God will protect us," playing counting games. The Palestinian Red Crescent sent an ambulance with 2 emergency respondents, Yusuf Zino and Ahmed Al-Madhoun, to rescue her. They never made it. It took 12 days till rescue teams were able to reach the area. They found the 2 members of the rescue team dead, and they found Hind, her aunt, her uncle, her 4 cousins, all dead. Our children deserve compassion and solidarity. They deserve compassion and solidarity. They are born into a terrible reality, and one generation after another fall victim to it. They are not less deserving of your outrage for their killing and their inhumane treatment. All families are entitled to dignified burial of their loved ones, all of them. And as you assert this principle, remember the images of Palestinian mothers and fathers collecting what remained of the bodies of their children in plastic bags, or carrying their corpses while being displaced for miles. Remember the thousands that remained under the rubble because we were not allowed to rescue them. Remember the hundreds of Palestinians' corpses still detained by Israel. When Israel decides to delay the release of hundreds of prisoners, including women and children, that is collective punishment. Israel has abducted thousands of civilians, and they were subjected to inhumane treatment and then released or disappeared. Did you see the images of our released prisoners? Often starved, with marks and scars on their bodies. Did you know Israel subjected them to beating before their release, or to humiliating and degrading treatment, and makes them wear clothes with provocative slogans on them and film them? Or these images never made it to you? Have you seen them? I'm sure you did. Israel considers these kinds of actions, all these actions, as normal and justified. Aren't all Palestinians presumed guilty by Israel? Do you? As my friend from Algeria said, no double standards. If you care about humanities and international law, don't exclude the Palestinians. Be fair. Deal with everyone, especially the children. Be fair. Justice does not serve only one group of people and ignore other children. It serves all of them. It is always strange to see Israeli officials who have called for unjustified genocide speak of the need for de-radicalization. The most extremist views are out there in the public sphere, including that Palestinians do not exist or do not deserve to exist, that raping and torturing prisoners is justified, that starving Palestinian civilians is morally justified, that all our children are guilty. And these are not only theoretical views. Israel is acting upon them. And if it is the one committing the action, it is no longer barbarism. To the contrary, it is the only to safeguard civilization. This is a narrative that countries in these halls know well, a narrative to justify the oppression of entire nations. Mr. President, what we need is not more violence. It is to break the cycle of violence. That's what we need. We can always find justification for revenge, but will it ever solve the problem? We owe it to our peoples, to our children, to end this conflict, not find reasons to continue perpetuating it. All children deserve to live in freedom and dignity and security. All children. We have repeated many times how important it was to be consistent. The rules of humanity and legality do not change with nationality, religion, or race. Human dignity should always be preserved, and civilians should always be protected, not killed, not paraded, not ill-treated. The sanctity of human life should be respected, and the respect owed to the dead should be honored. We reject all actions that run counter to these principles. As we ask you to know the stories of our children and to remember their names, we offer our condolences to the Bibas family. Nothing justifies what happened to Kfer and Ariel Bibas or their mother, Sherry. They should have been safe in their homes with their families, as our children should be safe in their home with their family. Challenge those to repeat the sentiment of humanity that we have, if they have any of it. We are collectively failing them, failing to offer the protection they deserve, failing to stop the suffering, failing to offer a different future. In Gaza, the loss of children and the loss experienced by children can barely be grasped. What they need now is not further uncertainty, but the knowledge that the world will be by their side. Mr. President, we said from the first day this assault will be against the Palestinian people as a whole. Through indiscriminate killing and wanton destruction, we said only a ceasefire can allow Palestinian and Israeli families to be reunited in life, can allow to put an end to the mass starvation of Palestinians, can allow to stop the effort for their forcible displacement. We said that Israel's goal was the remains annexation, and that after Gaza, Israel will intensify its assault on the West Bank. How many hostages were released in military actions, and how many hundreds of Palestinians have perished in these military attacks that were supposed to rescue the hostages but led to the death of many of them? And how many hostages have been released through ceasefire agreements? Ceasefire works. Ceasefire saves lives. For the U.S., the conclusion of this agreement and its implementation is about the hostages. But for Israel, was it? The next few days yet again test its true priorities. Will they destroy the ceasefire and resume fighting? Or will all of you, will all of us make the ceasefire permanent to save lives? Mr. President, the fate of our people is not to be killed and be displaced and be occupied and oppressed. No people would accept such a fate. Help us to demonstrate to our people that there is a peaceful path that leads to freedom and justice and peace. Palestinians and Israelis are not destined to be eternally at war. Peace is possible. Peace is possible. And after all this suffering, peace is indispensable. It is indispensable. It is imperative. We need it. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called children of God. Thank you.
I thank the permanent observer of the Observer State of Palestine for his statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Israel.
Thank you, Mr. President. and thank you, Special Coordinator Kach, for your briefing. Today marks a historic and deeply emotional moment. For the first time, a freed hostage has shared her story before this Council. Noa Argamani is not just a witness or a victim of Hamas's cruelty, she is a survivor. With unimaginable bravery and dignity, she has endured the unthinkable and emerged to speak for those who still cannot. Noa, we are honored by your presence, and we are praying every day for the safe return of your partner, Avinatan Or, and the 62 other hostages who remain in captivity. Noa, we thank you. We thank you for your courage, for your voice, and for speaking here today for those who cannot. But Noa should not have to be here today. She should not have to relive her trauma before this Council, nor should she have to remind the world of what Hamas is. And yet, here she is, because for months, so many around the world and on this Council have chosen to look away. Colleagues, it is time to finally pass a resolution here in this room to unequivocally condemn Hamas and designate it as a terrorist organization. It should have happened 16 months ago. I appreciated your words, Mr. Mansour, about the Bivas family, but still, you are not capable of saying the word Hamas in your speeches. You are ignoring it. In order to move forward, you have to acknowledge that Hamas will not be part of the equation. If they will be there, all your wishes will be lost. After Noa's testimony, I'm not sure how anyone in this room could possibly object to such a resolution. We have heard many times in this chamber doubts raised about our determination efforts. I am sure we will hear it again. However, there is no longer any need to justify why Hamas must be eradicated. The truth is undeniable. Hamas is a terrorist organization that slaughters, tortures, and kidnaps civilians. So Israel will continue to act. We will not be deterred. We will eliminate Hamas. Believe me when I say it. We will bring our people home, and we will secure the safety and future of Israel. Today, when you look at Noa sitting here in this chamber, remember the story behind the face you saw on that motorcycle. Remember the months she spent hidden from the world. Remember Yossi Sharabi and Itai Svirsky, who died beside her. Remember Avinatan Or, who still waits in the dark to be brought into the light. This is not simply Noa's story. It is a story of every hostage and every family shattered by Hamas's terror. It is a story that will not end until each one of them is back home. The question now is whether this Council will help write that ending or continue to look away. For months, Hamas has psychologically tortured and toyed with families desperate for answers. They have released hostage lists at last possible moment, forcing families into a cycle of unbearable uncertainty. They refuse to provide the Red Cross with access to the captives, leaving parents to go to sleep each night not knowing whether their children are dead or alive. And worst of all, they have played with the hostages themselves. You have heard, Noa, forcing them into their despicable theater of cruelty. Every time hostages are released, Hamas stages a sickening and vile ceremony designed to prolong the suffering of those still held captive. Just this past Saturday, those monsters forced Eviatar David and Guy Gilboa Dalal to watch one of these ceremonies from inside a van that brought them to the site. As they pleaded for their own release, their captors took every opportunity to prolong their sufferings. It is not a political strategy. It is a calculated, sadistic manipulation of human suffering. Nowhere has the cruelty been more evident than with the Bibas family. For over 500 days, Israelis and so many around the world, and many of you, have asked yourselves the same question. Is the Bibas family still alive? Those two beautiful boys? Now we know the answer. Hamas didn't just murder Ariel and Kfir. They slaughtered them in the most deprived way imaginable. They didn't shoot Kfir. They didn't shoot Ariel. They killed them with their bare hands. These monsters looked into the eyes of a 9-month-old baby and his 4-year-old brother and strangled, beat, twisted, and shattered them with their hands. One would imagine that there is nothing more sickening than this atrocity. Somehow there is. To hide their crime, they mutilated their tiny bodies to make it seem as though they died in an airstrike. This is Hamas. This is who they are in their souls: child murderers, butchers. And still, this council hesitates. Still, we hear statements that draw a parallel between Israel and Hamas, as though this is a symmetrical conflict. It's not. On one side, there are families holding on to hope. On the other side, there is an organization that murders infants and holds on to their bodies until it serves a political and propaganda purpose. Believe me, no matter what happens, our commitment to freeing all the hostages and completely eradicating Hamas is unshakable. We have heard endless discussions about humanitarian efforts in Gaza. You are all aware of the thousands of trucks entering Gaza every week, thousands, delivering aid. You have also all seen the videos, those grotesque parades during the release of the hostages and the return of their bodies. And in those very videos, the truth is clear. There is no starvation among Hamas, nor among the civilian population. The only starved people in Gaza are the hostages. We have seen their emaciated faces, their frail bodies, the undeniable evidence of months of deprivation. However, unimaginable suffering is clearly not worth the time of many on this council. Mr. President, tomorrow we will bury the bodies of Ariel, Kfir, and Shiri Bibas. Yarden Bibas' family is gone. The nation of Israel will come to a stop. We will escort the bodies of Ariel, Kfir, and Shiri to their final resting places. For months, Yarden endured unimaginable agony, unsure if his wife and children were alive, all while suffering in Hamas's hands. Now, thanks God, he is back in Israel, but his torment continues. Instead of captivity, he faces an unbearable silence. Where his wife and children should be, there is nothing. Hamas has lost any right or chance to be involved in the future of Gaza. The world has seen, through the story of Noah Argamani, the stories of Kfir and Ariel Bibas, and the stories of countless others, the extent of their cruelty. For the sake of the hostages, their families, and all those who truly seek peace, in this room, in Israel, in Gaza, it is time to let go of past conceptions. It is time to think beyond the frameworks of the past and build a new reality, one where terrorists do not hold entire communities hostage and where life is sacred once more. The path forward requires courage and imagination, out-of-the-box thinking, free of past conceptions and status quos. It also requires the Council to stand united against Hamas's tactics of terror and manipulation. To be able to build a better future, you must lay a solid foundation, a moral foundation. There is no avoiding the fact that this foundation requires a basic resolution condemning Hamas for their atrocities. I will not drop this issue. I will continue to remind you of your failing until it is finally corrected. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of Israel for the statement. And I'll give the floor to the representative of Kuwait.
شكرا السيد الرئيس أصحاب السعادة.
Thank you, Mr. President, Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. May the peace of God be upon you. It is my honor to take the floor on behalf of the Arab states. At the very beginning, and as we are moving towards the end of the Chinese presidency, the Arab group would like to congratulate you, Mr. President, congratulate you and the team, and China, a friendly country, will congratulate you and thank you for all of the efforts you've been making at the helm of the Council. You've been methodical and transparent. We also thank Ms. Sigrid Kaag, the interim special coordinator for the Middle East peace process, for her detailed briefing. Mr. President, the Arab group in February has continued its constructive action. We organized many meetings with people in charge here at the UN and the representative of various UN bodies. We also had meetings with many political and regional groups, and we had a meeting with the President of the Security Council, who in turn conveyed the contents of our meetings and our concerns to the Council. The goal of all of these meetings was to emphasize several essential measures having to do with the danger in the West Bank, and in particular in the north. We've all seen what has been happening there in the last days. And what we warned you of has taken place in front of the eyes of the entire international community. What we are witnessing in the West Bank now is unprecedented escalation, unprecedented for 2 decades. In fact, Israel, the occupying power, continues through its army, its tanks, continues with incursions and attacks in the West Bank. It's despicable what is happening. The goal is to force all of the Palestinians to move away from their territory. This unjustified attack, and which runs counter to all in that we have in the international law, including the IHL and the United Nations Charter, cost the lives of dozens of Palestinians, forcing 40,000 others to be displaced. That wasn't enough. The Minister of Defense of the occupying power declared that the Israelis will remain in their sites in the West Bank throughout 2025. The Arab states reaffirmed the need to put an end to the Israeli settlements, which was already rejected by the international community. We reiterate our position, which rejects any and all attempt to have a first displacement of Palestinians. This would be a war crime under the international conventions, and in particular under Article 49 of the Fourth Geneva Convention of 1949, which prohibits a forced transfer of civilians and occupied territories where they need to be protected. Furthermore, we insist on the need for the international community to undertake effective measures so as to guarantee that the Palestinian people can remain on their territory and enjoy all of its legitimate rights. We call on the international community to play a more active role so as to put an end to an aggression in the West Bank, and also to put an end to all of the attacks on the holy sites, both Christian and Muslim sites in Al-Quds al-Sharif. The actions by Israel show that Israel is not trying to return to calm. They're trying to undermine the ceasefire agreement in Gaza through a brutal escalation in the West Bank. In this context, the member states, do they still have any doubt remaining about the manipulation by the occupying entity, which is not honoring its commitments and trying to undermine any possibility to get to peace so that the occupying entity continues its crime of genocide against Palestinians? Will the Security Council remain silent while its serious violations continue, their war crimes and crimes against humanity? Are you waiting for a repetition of this, that this tragedy triggered by the occupying entity repeats in Gaza? Or will the Security Council get out of its lethargy after the death of tens of thousands of the Palestinians? Mr. President, the Arab group firmly rejects any form of forced transfer or displacement of the brotherly Palestinian people from their territory or their historic lands. We also reject any attempts to make states in the region bear the consequences of such displacement. We denounce, in particular, what the Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan was exposed to, and the Arab Republic of Egypt and the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia in the wake of attempts to do this with the Palestinian people. This will only complicate the situation and have nefarious effects on peace and the situation in the region, which in turn will impact international peace and security. We welcome the position of the international community when they firmly reject such appeals which run counter to international legality. If the Security Council remains incapable of putting an end to such a tragedy, which has been going on for 16 months, they need to commit themselves to implement their own resolutions, at least, and in particular, Resolution 2735, which calls inter alia for the following: an immediate, complete, comprehensive ceasefire, the return of Palestinian civilians to their homes and their neighborhoods throughout Gaza, the safe and effective distribution of humanitarian assistance at a large scale, and the rejection of any attempt to have a territorial or demographic change in the Gaza, including all measures aimed at reducing the territory of the Gaza Strip and the strict commitment to the two-state solution under international law and the United Nations resolutions to that effect. In fact, the adoption of that resolution provided a glimmer of hope, trying to put an end of Israeli aggression in Gaza. The occupying power disregards international legality and continues creating obstacles everywhere it can to peace and to the end of the aggression. Mr. President, the action by Israel, the occupying power, undermines the ceasefire, makes it more fragile. In fact, Israel has no respect for the major efforts made by Qatar, by Egypt, and the United States trying to arrive at this agreement. Let's recall that the main goal of the ceasefire agreement was to have a lasting and permanent ceasefire, creating a political horizon so as to implement the two-state solution. There will not be peace without a two-state solution under international legalities in all of its pillars. In this context, and together with the entire international community, we need to take place in the international conference, a high-level conference, which will take place at the General Assembly in June 2025, under the presidency of Saudi Arabia and France. And we call upon all member states to participate in this at the highest level and to do so actively. In the light of the above, and given that the occupying power does not respect the international legality, knowing that the occupying power continues making unilateral decisions which threaten peace and security regionally and internationally, thus undermining the multilateral work being done by this organization, the Arab group calls for an operationalization of an international independent commission entrusted with the investigations in the occupied Palestinian territories, including the East Jerusalem and in Israel. This was created in 2021 in the Human Rights Council. In fact, the violations committed by Israel, the occupying power, are constituent of war crimes and crimes against humanity, and this includes premeditated murder of children in the Gaza Strip. Here we are referring to more than 17,000 children. 17,000. Mr. President, the Arab group reaffirms its position of principle, which hasn't changed, which is in support of the rights of the Palestinians. We recall yet once again that the main cause of the conflict is the occupation, whose end we still do not see on the horizon. If we want to get to peace and security, we need to resolve the issue of Palestine by ensuring the creation of an independent, sovereign Palestinian state with a capital in East Jerusalem within the borders of the 4th June 1967, according to internationally undertaken legal decisions and the resolutions passed by the Security Council and the Arab Peace Initiative of 2002. As regards the Friendly Republic of Lebanon, we welcome the announcement made of the end of hostilities on the 27th of November 2024. However, the occupying power continues its flagrant violations of all conventions and international custom. It continues, therefore, to violate this agreement, whilst Lebanon fully upholds the commitment it undertook in this matter. The date for the withdrawal of the occupying power Israel from the occupied villages has passed, and the occupying power continues its occupation of 5 border points, which is a flagrant violation of the various points in the agreement. And we keep repeating this. The occupying power has no respect for international conventions. It's not looking for peace. Quite the contrary, it's looking to undermine peace and security in the region and in the world. The Arab group calls on the Security Council to shoulder its responsibility and to compel Israel to fully withdraw from all of the occupied Lebanese territory and to implement the relevant resolution 1701 here. For as long as this withdrawal does not take place, we will not have stability. Furthermore, UNIFIL plays an essential role in this stage, in particular, given the need to have the Israeli withdrawal beyond the blue line. UNIFIL is also there to observe the implementation of 1701, and we call on the international community to stand shoulder to shoulder with the Republic of Lebanon and support them in their reconstruction efforts and support the Lebanese armed forces to make sure that the Lebanese state can restore its control over the entire territory. When it comes to the Syrian Arab Republic, also a brotherly country, we firmly denounce Israeli incursions, repeated incursions into the buffer zone and neighboring sites near Mount Hermon and Quneitra Governorate and Deira Governorate and in Damas area. This is an additional aggression and flagrant violation of international law. We also denounce the statements made by the Prime Minister of the occupying entity, which threaten the unity and sovereignty of Syria, thus trampling underfoot all of the rules and international customs. We call for an immediate and unconditional withdrawal of Israeli forces from all of the Syrian territory. We also call for the respect and the upholding of the disengagement agreement of 1974. It is also necessary to respect the UNTV mandate and the relevant resolutions of the Security Council, including Resolution 242, Resolution 338, and the Resolution 497. We reaffirm that the Golan Heights is a Syrian Arab territory which is occupied. By way of conclusion, and to go back to Palestine, which is the main cause and a #1 priority for the Arab group, we recall for the international community that the occupying Israeli army has shown the greatest cowardice possible since the beginning of the aggression of Gaza. They had no respect for the bodies of the dead people. Their remains have been exposed, homes attacked, infrastructure destroyed. This shows the greatest possible cruelty given this human tragedy. This is what we have seen in various sites and in various social media.
I thank the representative of Kuwait. There are no more names inscribed on the list. The meeting is adjourned.